sometimes you wonder when you're given the opportunity to make an introduction like this, just what you should say. You know, here's a gentleman who comes here. This is probably his 6th visit in the last 7 years, or something like that, to the business community. And so, rather than an introduction, which I won't read through, it's on here. Rather than to give you an introduction, I'd rather, on your behalf, on behalf of the other sponsors, behalf of the chamber, the business community, the schools who are represented here with Melissa and several of the staff people, along with the city of Eden Prairie, represented in form of people like Brad Aho, and I know Scott Neal's here. I'm not sure what other council people are here. On your behalf, let me extend a welcome to Governor Tim Pawlenty, the 39th governor of the state of Minnesota. And I do that with a great deal of sincerity because I think business people, people in education, and community leaders need to be representing and reaching out back to the governor to say thank you for the great job that you've done, for working for these past 8 years under very difficult economic circumstances, to balance the budget, because that's required. Every biennial budget has to be balanced, and there have been some very real challenges, I think, as all of us realize. Working to change and redefine what I would call the proper role of government, putting it into a situation where government really is about doing for others what they can't do for themselves, but not providing all kinds of things that we really, frankly, probably can't afford. And for changing the pathway and the pace of the growth of government in this state and turning it down so that we can, in fact, as healthcare costs grow and as other costs grow, that we can, in fact, as a business community, thrive and do better, build jobs. And so it's really with that in mind that I would just like to say a welcome to the governor, a thank you to the governor for providing the vision that's needed, the leadership that's needed to accomplish those types of things, which are not easy in this current environment, particularly these last years since 2008, when it has just been immensely pressing to try to make everything work. And we're grateful for your leadership, Governor. We're very pleased that you would be willing, so close after the last legislative session, to take the time to come out once again and visit with us in Eden Prairie. So on behalf of the business community and the schools and the city of Eden Prairie and the Eden Prairie Chamber membership, welcome to Eden Prairie, and thanks for taking the time.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to come back. It seems like every year after the session ends and I'm sleep deprived, I have an invitation to come to the Eden Prairie Chamber of Commerce, and it's a good way to start the summer and to reflect a little bit on the legislative session that was and the years that I've served as governor, but also talk to you a little bit about some thoughts about where we go from here as a state. But let me first thank the Chamber of Commerce for the important role that you play as a business voice, as a voice for job growth in our state. The Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and its affiliate chapters, including the Eden Prairie Chamber of Commerce, is the single most important pro-jobs, pro-business voice in the state of Minnesota. And so there's a great debate in the country right now about what are those things that we can do to encourage, not discourage, job growth. And the answer to that question does not reside in the politicians in Washington, D.C., or frankly the politicians in St. Paul, Minnesota at the Capitol, most of whom have never worked in the private sector in their lives. The answer to that question lies to those people who each and every day take risks, deploy capital, build buildings, buy equipment, add jobs, and provide the quality of life opportunity that comes with a growing pro-jobs, pro-business environment. There are many, many other groups who want your money and want to spend it in a different direction in politics. And basically what happens is politicians say to the public, to the taxpayers, give us $1 of your money. The government takes it into its system, takes 20 or 30 cents on a dollar for overhead and spins it around as it processes it, and then redeploys, say, 70 or 80 cents on a dollar back into the economy according to political priorities or political judgments, and then they call that economic growth. Now, any of you who are even a semi-serious student of economics know that that is not growth. That is what economists call transference effects or substitution effects. So if I took $1 from Valerie and I took my cut for overhead and then spent 70 cents of it over here, the economy doesn't grow by $1. We just transferred Valerie's dollar. Valerie would have spent it anyhow. Valerie would have bought dinner tonight or put it in her student's or son or daughter's college account, or would have invested it or saved it. She would have deployed that dollar in the private economy according to her priorities, her value judgments, her risk tolerance, her entrepreneurial spirit, and the like. And instead, I vacuum it from Valerie, not me, of course, but the government more broadly. I'm giving it back to Valerie, or not taking it in the first place. And once you get into the political system, very different decision-making gets made. So that's not to say that government doesn't have important things to do. What it is to say, though, is that there needs to be a debate and a resolution about the proper size and scope and priorities of government. And for those things that government does do, it should be limited. But for those things it does do, it should be effective, and it should be accountable for results. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you this morning about a few thoughts, and then I'll leave time for questions as well. But I sometimes imagine what it would be like to see the government version of that famous MasterCard commercial from a few years ago. So the commercial would come up, and you'd have the voiceover come up and say, the Wall Street bailout, $800 billion. The stimulus package, $850 billion. The cap and trade, $2,000 per household. The health care reform, $2.4 trillion. The price of political change this November, priceless. Now, those are just some examples that gets people's attention at the federal level, but truth be told, we have a fundamental problem that has unfolded across the nation, and it's at the federal level. It's at the level of many states. It's at the level of many counties and local units of government as well, although I was just told by Brad at lunch here today that at least for the city of Eden Prairie, their budget was held level and were able to cut some costs and streamline some things and keep the level down. But the bottom line is this. If you look at government spending in a macro sense, what you will see is spending, particularly entitlement spending, going up about like that, and revenues going up about like that, if at all. And so even if we can get back to the good old days of 2 or 3% GDP growth, there is no way that the spending model that the federal government has built and many other levels of government have built are justified by the likely projected revenues going forward. And so that gap has to be addressed. And it is not limited to this moment in time in Minnesota. It is a phenomena that is sweeping the country. So the country is waking up to this. For the first time in my adult life, you have people outside of politics, not politicians or activists or people engaged in the process, but just everyday people who will say, this deficit and debt and spending levels beyond the revenue levels just isn't going to work. I mean, just the math doesn't work. And so it's not so much a matter of right or left or Republican or Democrat. It's a matter of junior high mathematics. I mean, you can look at the spending commitments and the trajectory that it's on. You can look at the likely revenues, and you can pretty clearly see the gap. I mean, an 8th grader can see the problem. And so what do we do about that? And the answer will vary, I think, by state or by region around the country. But at least for Minnesota, I wanted to give you some data devoid of political rhetoric that I think informs the answer or the conclusion. From 1960, the year I was born, yes, that makes me soon to be 50 later this year. I got my ARP card in the mail the other day. Do you believe that? It went quickly towards the to be filed pile. But in any event, from 1960 until I became governor of the state of Minnesota, the average 2-year increase from 2-year budget cycle to 2-year budget cycle in state spending was 21%. 21%. I mean, 40 years of just absolute, 45-degree angle spending increases. And when you think about the exponential effect as that compounds over the years and the decades, it's extraordinary. Nothing was growing 21% every 2 years during that same time period, and yet government was on an absolute rocket ride. And frankly, regardless of who was governor or who was in the legislature, some folks back then, claiming to be tight with a dollar, even the spending went dramatically up. Now, that's not going to work going forward. You can't have government going up in double digits when the economy is going up not at all or barely into single digits. So one of the things I've done as governor is to slow down that train. We now have spending on average during my watch down to about 2% a year. Now, that's an increase, by the way. Now, some people find that to be very controversial, and it has been. I mean, to be very blunt about it, Minnesota has a political tradition and culture and history that, for the most part, is very different than what I think should happen. So there's been a collision of the culture of the past and what I would call the necessity of the present and the culture of the future. And so we're having this moment where there's going to be a fork in the road on this issue. Now, if you look at Minnesota and just put up the dashboard on the numbers of our competitiveness, so if you were in your business and you were doing a competitiveness analysis, put up the dashboard indicators of the strategic difference makers for your enterprise, see how you do compared to your competitors, and it forms your decision making. So in Minnesota, one of the great ways to do that is to put up the competitiveness indicators against the 49 other states who are competitors on a variety of fronts. If you do that, what you will see is this. We are quite competitive when it comes to the whole cluster of healthcare issues. Within each of these we have some challenges, but in general, our healthcare quality, our healthcare costs, access to healthcare in Minnesota is at or near the top of the nation. So we're not lacking in competitiveness in terms of healthcare. Well, frankly, we have to reduce costs in that area, as you all know who provide healthcare or are involved in it from a business standpoint. Well, what about the larger social service basket in Minnesota? We have amongst the most generous social services in the country. In fact, they are so generous, I would suggest to you, they need to be reformed and slowed down because they're sucking all the financial oxygen away from some other priorities we have to do. But you can't look at that and say we're somehow deficient in what we provide in that area. If you look at natural resources and outdoors for people who enjoy natural resources and the outdoors, we're amongst the top in the country. I mean, we have beautiful natural resources and assets, and again, some challenges, but basically we've got amongst the best commitment to the outdoors and conservation in the country. When you look at arts and culture and amenities, the Twin Stadium, the Gopher Stadium, maybe a Viking Stadium, Roy, I don't know, but we're not lacking in that area. So what is it then that Minnesota is out of balance? People like balance. They want to have a sense that these things are all important. They need to be interdependent with each other. But which areas then are we out of whack in? Now, I want to just highlight two of them for you, retrospectively and prospectively. And the first is Minnesota needs to be a more pro-jobs, pro-business state. We have to reform our tax code with those goals in mind. We did a study of all the states in the Union from 2003 until the economic collapse of 2008 to see where jobs were growing and how that correlates to levels of government spending and the like. And what you'll see is just about every state in Minnesota, above Minnesota I should say, in job growth, spent less, not more, on government than Minnesota. There was a few exceptions that have very sparse populations, but generally the migration of economic activity, investment, the deployment of entrepreneurial capital, the adding of jobs was migrating significantly from places like the Great Lakes in the Northeast to the South and to the West. Those are people making rational decisions about where to deploy capital. It's not an accident. The pattern is overwhelming. In the years 2007 and 2008, over half of the jobs in the entire country, over half of all the jobs created in the entire country were created in Texas. Now, Minnesota doesn't need to change who we are and what we are, but we need to make sure that we're not so smug about our past and how special we think we are that we think we can price ourselves out of the market and not have that have a detrimental effect as to where people decide to start and grow businesses and add jobs. So we have a tax code in this state. Every governor for 30 years, including Rudy Perpich, said, can we at least get Minnesota out of the top 10 in taxes? Nobody ever did. We finally did that a couple of years ago. We got all the way down to 11th. But if we don't keep vigilant on these issues, it'll snap back to second or third or the like. And so, this is going to take some time. Now, the other issue is, as it relates to the type of taxes in Minnesota, if you look at our business tax rate, our corporate tax rate, if Minnesota were a country by itself, it would have the third highest corporate tax rate in the world. In the world. And so you have companies like 3M who will say, we're growing really nice. We just choose not to grow here. It's too darn expensive. And if you have too many of those stories, pretty soon you start to lose a momentum and critical mass in ways that are very corrosive. We are very proud of our quality of life in Minnesota. And when you ask people, well, what do you mean by quality of life? Different people will answer it differently. They'll say, well, I love to fish or hunt, or I love to go watch the Twins, or I love to just bike or hike around a lake, or I love to get involved in community or civic or charitable organizations. But bottom line is, if people don't have access to a job, they're not going to have a good quality of life, because it's pretty darn hard to go buy a shotgun to go duck hunting unless you have a job. Pretty tough to go up to Eric's bike shop and buy a new bike if you don't have a job. Pretty tough to go get that Vikings ticket and go down to the stadium if you don't have a job. So all of these other things are really interesting and they're important, but the number one thing should be, what are those things we can do to make this a place where it's more likely where people are going to grow jobs, add jobs, start businesses, grow businesses, stabilize, and stay? And the answer, again, lies with this group. And what they tell me most often is, Governor, you got to have a more pro-business standpoint. Not me, but the state has to have a more pro-business perspective. And so we've made good progress in this regard, and that progress needs to continue. It takes the forms of taxes. It takes the form of regulations. It takes the form of permitting processes and the length of time that permits take and the cost associated with permit. It takes the form of energy costs. It takes the form of workers' compensation and unemployment insurance costs. All of those things and more together create a basket of cost competitiveness for which there is a mathematical measure. We can stack it up against the rest of the country, and we're too high. And so I'm glad that we have reduced it, but we've got more to do in that regard. The other issue I want to talk to you about, it just as a matter of strategic imperative, is the state and future of our education system in Minnesota. Because we can do some things to square up on costs, but we're never probably going to be the lowest cost provider or place in the country or the world for obvious reasons. And frankly, we don't necessarily need to be, because we got some other advantages. One of those advantages that is a strategic difference maker for Minnesota is the fact that we've got an education system that has historically performed extremely well. We've got the highest ACT scores in the country. We've got the highest high school graduation rates, or nearly so, in the country. We have some of the best internationally benchmarked results for math and science in Minnesota. If we were a country by ourselves, we'd be 5th or 6th or 7th in the world. That's dramatically better than our scores in the 1990s. And on down the list. But that story unfolds in a way that is a little misleading, because those are the results for students who have families that are together, communities that are together. Those are average results. But if you look at students who are disadvantaged for whatever reason, the results are awful. And they've been awful for 30 years. We cannot be a successful country leaving a third of our team on the bench. And that's what we're doing. We got, not in Minnesota, but nationally, a third of our students dropping out of high school. That's not going to work economically. That's not going to work morally. That's not going to work socially. It's not even going to work politically. Even if you're conservative in this room, if you want to worry about reducing the demands on government, if somebody is uneducated or unskilled and they drop out of high school, a generation or two ago, if you grew up in South St. Paul, where I grew up, if you were my mom or my dad or my grandma or my grandpa, you could still go get what they called the strong back job, as long as you weren't disabled. But now, if you don't have an education or a skill that's relevant to the economy of today and tomorrow, you are marginalized instantly, and you become a ward of the state. And so these demands for more government everything, more government health care, more government transportation, more government housing, more government fill-in-the-blank stuff, is in large part of a reflection of the fact that people can't afford it themselves. And the reason they can't afford it themselves is because in many cases, again, unless they face a disability or other challenge, is they lack the education or the skill to meaningfully access the economy that is today and tomorrow. And so we have to fix this. Today, as just one example, we announced Minnesota will not be going forward with the next round of the Race to the Top application. The reason we will not be going forward is because the Minnesota legislature, and I have to be very blunt about this, controlled by the DFL, refuses to make the changes necessary for our education system to transform and reform to compete, not just for a race to the top. That's just kind of a ceremonial race to do things that need to get done anyhow. But this is no longer a matter of Tim Pawlenty versus the teacher unions. This has now been embraced by President Obama. This has been embraced by U.S. Secretary of Education Duncan. These are changes, the kinds of changes that are needed to be made that we asked the legislature to make this year, embraced by governors and states all over the country of both parties. And the types of changes we're talking about relate to teacher training, teacher recruitment, teacher compensation, teacher accountability, and the rigor that goes into teacher oversight and supervision, and if need be, teacher dismissal. And we have a system that is 40 or 50 years out of date. And the individuals who are in that system will not allow it to be changed, as reflected by the positions of their very powerful Minnesota Teacher Union Group. And so it's a frustrating thing, but people need to be informed about these changes and how strategically imperative they are to our future, and the fact that we have one group predominantly that is stopping the changes. This is unfolding across the country. I guarantee you that most of these changes will take place even here, but they only will take place if people understand generally what they are, understand what the roadblock is to making that change, and then demand that their legislators or other policymakers actually get them done. And I'll just give you one quick example. If you're in business in this room, I bet you most of you have a pretty good system for defining what it is the strategic focus of your enterprise is. I bet you also have some pretty specific numerical measurements about whether progress is being made towards that goal or not. And then lastly, I would suggest to you, I bet you have a pretty good system for aligning money to whether that progress is made or not. So how many of you in this room, if you're not in government, get paid for just how many years you've been around? Anybody? The world has moved on. The world has moved on. And the response in this room reflects the response I get every day all over the state, everywhere. We don't pay anymore people for just being around another 3 or 4 or 5 years. How many of you get to work a probationary period for a few years and then have 10-year job protection for the rest of your life if you're not in government? That's not the way the world works anymore. So the reality of it is we have this tenured, seniority-based, industrial model that was designed for a bygone era, for bygone students, with the interests of adults and union priorities in mind, without regard to what's best for children. Now, we have other states around the country doing what we should be doing in Minnesota, and that is we have to be able to define and measure student performance, and if teachers are not making reasonable growth in their students' academic achievement from year to year, those teachers need to have either extra help, additional or alternative resources, or they need to be removed. And that's not what's happening. So they used to say, well, wait a minute now, the teacher unions, you can't do that to us because we don't get to pick the kids in our class, and many come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and so it's unfair to compare us to Edina or Eden Prairie. And we say, that's right, but guess what? Now we have the ability to measure yourself against yourself. So when the students come in the door in the fall and there's something called the growth model, we can measure precisely how much progress is going to be made in key areas like math and reading and some others from the fall to the spring. Not compared to some other district, but your students, your class, over your year, can you add a reasonable amount of academic growth from fall to spring in those students? And what Colorado and Delaware and some other states are saying is, if you're a teacher and you don't do that 3 years in a row, you're gone. We're not going to tolerate anymore teaching that does not result in reasonable growth over reasonable periods of time, not compared to some idealized notion. Your students, as you find them, percentage-wise, can you add a reasonable growth year to year? Now, if you look at that as you can, if you want, get this right down to a particular classroom or right down to a particular school site. And you might say, well, Mr. Johnson's teaching fourth grade math. And all the other fourth graders' math progresses like this, except Mr. Johnson's class goes like that. Now, if that happens one year, you might say, odd year for whatever reason. Mr. Johnson, had some issues. Well, maybe he needs a different textbook, maybe some other help. But if that happens 2 or 3 years in a row, compared to the other teachers in the system, pretty soon you conclude Mr. Johnson's got some issues. And maybe Mr. Johnson better either get it fixed or Mr. Johnson's got to get another job. That's how the world works. And so that kind of talk is revolutionary in government, but it needs to become commonplace. And that's how you would run your business, and that's increasingly how we need to demand additional accountability from schools. So those are only 2 thoughts amongst many, but I think they are amongst the most important issues for the future of our state. We have the ability to get them done and move them forward, I think, in profound ways, but we need people to mobilize. You got Jennifer Loon here, who is already a superstar, is going to be even more of a superstar in the legislature, and David Han and others, they get this intuitively, so they're really not the issue. But we need the business community and the state more broadly to rally around these causes and hold the individuals and groups who are accountable for roadblocking these reforms to account. And they're very powerful. I mean, they're very powerful. They have a lot of money. They get involved in politics in a very powerful way. And we need to make sure that they're not just serving their own agenda, they're serving the agenda of what's best for the students. There is no education bill that passed this year at all. None, 0. The only thing that passed this year is a bill to improve the benefits, pension and health care benefits for teachers, which I vetoed. I said, before you start talking about enhancing your benefits, let's start talking about enhancing the educational opportunities for children. So thank you for listening. I'd love to hear your questions or comments. It's been an honor being your governor, and I'll be back to play some golf in coming years. Who's got some questions? It's a shy group here at the Eden Prairie Chamber of Commerce. Yes, sir.
What happens during the next biennium when they're already talking potentially $6 billion?
Dick asked about what happens in the next biennium, which is legislative speak for the next 2-year budget cycle, which has a projected $5.6, $5.7 billion deficit. A couple of things. One is that wouldn't be there if they would have passed my budget. I presented a budget in February that would have had that cut by more than half, and they refused to pass it. And we asked them to make these cuts permanent, which would largely have eliminated or reduced that budget. They refused to do it. But there's an easy way to knock it down. So of the $5.6 billion deficit, $2 billion of it is a school payment deferral. So schools get paid on a schedule from the state. They used to get 90% of their money in the preceding fiscal year, and then there was a settle-up of 10%. That got shifted over time to now it's 70-30. So schools get all of their money. They just get a portion of it a little later than they otherwise would. And this is what the state has always done during recessions and downturns, make this schedule change, payment schedule change. And then when things look a little brighter, they shift it back the other way. The budget on the table assumes that whole shift snaps off and you go back to 90-10 in one step right away next biennium. That's never happened in the history of the state. Nobody's ever done the payment deferral like that and snapped it all back in 1 year. It's unrealistic. It won't happen. Next year they will vote some variation of what I just described. So that takes the 5.6 down to 3.6. I asked them to make my unallotments permanent. They refused to do it. So they all come back to life at the beginning of the next budget cycle. The state's already been living with those cuts for over a year, and by the time the next legislative session starts, they'll have been lived with the cuts for 2 years, and not much adverse happened. A fairly easy thing to do, especially since the legislators all voted on the tough vote already. Extend those and make them permanent. That makes $1 billion less. So you go from 5.6, school shift's worth 2, that brings you down to 3.6. If you make the unallotments permanent, that brings you down to 2.6. I think there's a few other, I'd say, relatively easy things you could do to get it down to sub 2. And then there'll be 3 or 4 other economic changes between now and then. But it's, you get within a range of what I call manageable. There's never been recently a projection for the out biennium that has been balanced. It's always off somewhat. You just got to get it within a reasonable striking range. So there's going to be a lot of fretting about that in terms of the political rhetoric, but 2 or 3 fairly simple maneuvers and the thing essentially melts away, or at least is dramatically reduced. Yes, sir.
Governor, California has about 20 counties and has still managed to drive into the economic ditch. What do you think the prospect is for consolidating our 87 county system to save money?
Well, there was a representative from Rochester, David Bishop, who was kind of a legendary legislator. He pushed that for many years, could never get it done. We looked at that 2 years ago and said that makes a lot of sense, but let's start as a test just to see if we can consolidate not counties, but force them to consolidate services. So each county has its own, human services department with its own human services director, own database, own staff, eligibility, compliance, all that stuff. So we said you will either get less of a cut or more of an increase if you're willing to consolidate the operation of those services. And frankly, a lot of it is backroom stuff. We don't need everybody having all 87 replications of that. Common sense to you, if you were running a business, you would snap your fingers and order it done and it would get done. Legislature, not again Jennifer, but didn't do it, didn't even touch it. Oh no, we can't do that. That would cost, somebody a job in a county. You'd lose the computer programmer in county X. You'd lose the. So every county wants to hang on to everything they've got. The only way to do it is to force it, and the political will is not yet there to do it, but it's coming. If you see the message of people outside of government, they've had it. They want change. They want accountability. They want reform. We have done a lot of that over the last 8 years. We've consolidated state agencies. We have moved teachers from the beginnings of seniority pay to performance pay and lots of other stuff. But this county issue is stubborn, and the will does not yet exist in the legislature to do it. Yes, sir.
How would you finance the Viking Stadium?
How would I finance the Viking Stadium? Well, if it were up to me, to be very blunt about it, there's enough money in professional football for them to pay for their own stadiums, but they don't because they don't have to. So all the economics of it get distorted because everybody subsidizes the stadium. So for the Vikings to say, if we're going to, in order for us to be competitive, we have to compete with these other places that got subsidized. In an ideal world, if nobody got subsidized, they would all have their benchmark lowered. But that isn't the world we live in. So they're in a league where all the other teams, for the most part, have had a subsidy as it relates to the stadium, and it's a distorted market, so we're benchmarking against a distorted market. All of that being said, the Vikings are a valuable asset. When somebody says, well, why not me, for my business or my enterprise, I say, well, does your enterprise get 85% of the state watching it on Sunday afternoon, glued to the television? No. So it is a unique enterprise, but I think the elements of it are this. We value the Vikings. They're not going to stay in the Metrodome. It is going to come to a head soon. There's going to have to be a reasonable solution, but it starts with this. They need to have a local partner identified. If you look at how these deals get done around the country, almost every one of them involves a local city, a local county, a region, but at least a city or a county that wants to host it and wants to help finance it. When the Twins deal got done, there's no state money in that deal, but Hennepin County came forward and said, we're partners with the Twins. They had a press conference, they had a plan, and it got done. So here you have the Vikings kind of floundering around, no local partner, no specific plan, saying, solve my problem for me. It starts with, who's your local partner? Is it Minneapolis? Is it Hennepin County? Is it another county? We don't know. And they don't know. There's some fairly, I don't want to say easy, but relatively non-controversial ways to do this. But you have to have one of those local partners in mind. Now, some of the ideas that have been tossed around by others include this. In Minneapolis, there is a tax that's already exists. It's already been authorized. You don't have to raise it. But its use for the convention center tails off in the not-too-distant future. Minneapolis could simply redirect some of that money to pay in partnership for a Viking Stadium if they want one. It's pretty clear the Twins are going to pay off their stadium pretty early, even before the schedule as well as the other stuff. So, they're going to have excess capacity without raising a tax if they were allowed to or encouraged to redirect some of that money. So those are just two examples. I said earlier if we're going to have a new lottery game, which we did, called Mega Millions. It came out in January. It wasn't part of the state's budget. Nobody had booked the money or counted for the money. It was a significant amount of money every year. If you want to earmark that for the Vikings' use, that was at least something worth exploring or discussing. So you could patch together a plan, but it starts with the Vikings, I think, recruiting and identifying a local partner who wants to be part of the plan. But in terms of just a pure economic or philosophical statement, I would say if nobody subsidized these stadiums, they'd still get built because there's enough money in football to build them, but they don't have to, and they're now benchmarking against the distorted market of everybody else being subsidized, and if one team doesn't get it, then they're at relative disadvantage. Let's go somewhere over here. Way in the back, John.
Governor, I think most people would concur that the educational process needs accountability and responsibility, but there's a systemic problem in relationship to North Minneapolis and Eden Prairie. For instance, my friend Melissa, who grew up in Nebraska and wanted to be a teacher all her life, was teaching in North Minneapolis, and the new rules came in where they're judging her. And what happened is in September, she had a class, but by November, 40% of those people had changed because those people are in such transition. So any plan that broad brushes things, it almost has to address the culture as well as the program.
Yeah, the number one determining factor of how a child's going to do in school is their parents. And by that I mean the degree of engagement, involvement, support, encouragement that parents give the child generally, but particularly as their educational life. But we also have to be careful. I did some mentoring work at Franklin Middle School some years ago. There are districts and classrooms and sites that have lots of challenge. Transitory attendance, language barriers, English as a second language, poverty, many other things. But if we say, we're going to hold that to those students to a lower standard, then we're basically conceding that that won't work. And what we're finding is, if you do the types of reforms that I, President Obama, Secretary Duncan have done, and you do them rigorously in places like New York, in places like Chicago, places like Boston, and some others, and you isolate those results after those changes are made and then compare them to challenged populations that didn't make the changes, like in Detroit or other areas, the research shows the places that made the changes are having academic improvement of a significant and measurable nature, even in challenged populations. And so I hear what you're saying. It is a more challenging situation, but I do not accept the premise that because there's challenge that somehow we're going to water down the expectations. In fact, we need to, I think, put a brighter spotlight on it. But these changes are helping improve the academic outlook in the populations that you're describing. So I want to make sure we are of one mind. I'm not going to throw up my hands and say just because somebody's got life challenges, they don't need to learn like everybody else. Yes, sir.
I'm kind of a person that believes in living within our means, and I'm guessing, who do you recommend to be your replacement?
Well, you can probably guess. I'm not here to give a political speech because I'm on my official duty and time clock and all the rest. But if you get to know the candidates, I think there'll be one that you will see lines up with my views and beliefs, and the others do not. Yes, sir.
Why won't the state consider a professional sports gaming to help finance the Viking Stadium? Is that just too far out of the box?
No, but it's, again, I'll be very blunt with you. I tried to introduce a broader discussion about gaming in Minnesota some years ago. I don't know if you remember this. It was probably like circa 2005 or something. We have Native American gaming that operates as a monopoly or semi-monopoly status in Minnesota. The folks who entered into the contracts with them back in the 1980s gave them a contract with no expiration date on it. it's fairly close to unique in the country. Now, I don't know if they did that intentionally, mischievously, or incompetently, but unlike in other states, they never come up for renewal. So we have these franchises that are essentially monopolies that go forever. And so we said, and by the way, they benefit a relatively small percentage of the Native Americans in Minnesota. Most of the Native Americans in Minnesota get no benefit from that. So there's these enormous Native American tribes, particularly in northern Minnesota, White Earth, Red Lake, many other places that are exponentially larger than the ones who have the current gaming franchises and get very little or no benefit. And so we said, can we rearrange this so that these northern tribes would benefit and the state would benefit in a modest realignment of the gaming landscape in Minnesota? And I got my you-know-what handed to me. I mean, I got it from the right and the left for different reasons. It didn't even get off the ground or even seriously considered. And this was all of the power, attention that a governor can bring to an issue. The fact of the matter is there is not the political will at the legislature to make any change in gaming. If you put it to the people of Minnesota, they would support it 70%. But the folks who are inside the legislature who get to decide that aren't anywhere close to approving it, including Racino, by the way. Yes?
What would you like to do for your next job?
Well, what I'd like to do is play defense for the Minnesota Wild, but I'm too old, too slow, and don't have any talent in that regard. But I don't know. I'm going to take some time. I'm going to try to do what I can to stay involved in public policy and some politics at least through 2010, and then I'll decide what to do next after that. If all goes poorly, I'm going to open a margarita bar and play some Kenny Chesney music down in South Florida. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.